Welcome everybody to this second in conversation with experts in the field in relation to research ethics. The presentation that hopefully you have been able to look at outlines the main ethical principles of research, and the purpose of this session is to delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues that we commonly find ourselves having to deal with whilst doing research and other knowledge exchange activities in particular countries. Sometimes research ethics is specific to the country we're researching, or the locality, the region, or the population. So this is really an opportunity to hear about some of the challenges and the successes of applying research ethics to our project. And I'm delighted this morning to have a conversation with Professor Joe Devine, and Joe is a professor of global development. So before we talk about some of the ethics to do with the particular specific country, Joe, that you've been researching, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into research and some of the research that you've been doing over the last 30 years or so?
Thanks, Rachel. So I think I have to put my hand up and say I never wanted to be a researcher. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I vowed to myself that I wouldn't go back to study or read another book. Why did I then return to study? Between 1989 and 1992, I was living in Bangladesh, working as a volunteer practically. And I was living in the south of Bangladesh amongst communities of Hindu outcasts, so marginalised groups. And these were, even within Hinduism, they were known as the name suggests, as outcasts. In other words, they had to be kept at the periphery of society. And that time spent with them, I think, put another kind of fire in my belly in terms of thinking about injustices in the world. And so when I finished 3 years there, I came back and started studying already with a clearer focus and lens of why I wanted to study and research, which was about addressing some form of injustice in our world. So having done the 3 years in Bangladesh, I practically did all of my master's and my PhD always focused on Bangladesh and South Asia. And part of my PhD, I spent another year in Bangladesh doing field work amongst landless people. And again, these were oppressed, in inverted commas, by elites who were basically stealing the land from them. So again, that theme of trying to find ways, especially which collective action might address injustices, became important to me. And ever since the PhD, the completion of it, and that was in 2000, I've been going back, and I mean, I've been to Bangladesh practically every year, except this year because of COVID. I've also done work in other countries in South Asia, and that's really my focus. The kind of issues that I've been looking at, I think they generally have been around attempts to mobilize or facilitate collective action amongst people who, let's call them for the sake of it, are disadvantaged, marginalised or poor. So in the past, I've done work around land reform. I've worked with NGOs and civil society movements. I've been doing quite a lot of work recently for the last 10 years, perhaps, on extreme poverty. And I've also been working with NGOs, not necessarily researching them, but trying to think through strategies about how to better serve the people that they are focusing on. So it's been quite a long engagement in South Asia, a very long engagement in Bangladesh, and topics covered have been quite varied, from governance and rights through to extreme poverty. My own background is I'm a qualitative researcher, but I work and I enjoy working with people who have quantitative skills, because the nature of what I'm trying to focus on, I think, requires interdisciplinary as well as a broad range of research skills.
Okay, well, it's highly interesting, and clearly you've been doing both intervention work and policy work, as well as charting the experiences and the lives of those people. And you're an expert on Bangladesh, and you've had a lot of experience going there and doing field work. amongst those people. So what would you say have been over the years the main ethical issues that you've had to grapple with? And they may have changed from when you first started in 2000 to 20 years later. The ethical issues are changing all the time, and I guess both in terms of working with NGOs but also working with individuals themselves.
I think that the biggest change for me has been how ethics has figured in my research. And I never imagined, even when I started out, that I was carrying out research unethically, but it was more or less my own instinct or decisions that was the ethics. There wasn't anything to be anything formal or anything institutionalized. So the institutionalization, which I think has been a positive thing of ethics within research, is the biggest change. I think at a more personal level, my biggest ethical challenge goes back to that idea of a fire in the belly. So I'm quite open with colleagues, and I'm quite open when I teach students, when I tell them that I'm quite biased in my research. Yeah? I have no problem if someone called me militant in my research. So this idea of research being unbiased, I always found a bit strange, because as a social scientist, I carry out research in order to address what I consider to be injustices. So there's a very strong biased focus and rationale for the research that I do. Now, clearly, as a researcher, I have to make sure that those biases don't come in. So I can still be militant, I can still be activist, but I need to be able to do the research in a way that's transparent and rigorous and all of that. So that's the first one. I think over time, the big change that's happened is, as we get better at research and people get to know about our research, I've seen that I've been much more involved over the last decade with elites in my research, whether those be politicians or policy elites or civil society leaders. And I've never lost the focus of working with those who are marginalised, in inverted commas, but then working with them as well as with elites puts you in two, I think, quite distinct universes. But that's exactly what I want to do with my research. At one level, I want it to bridge, situations where people are marginalised or disadvantaged or whatever, with people who can make decisions. And effectively, you're trying to open up a dialogue through your research between them. But working with elites brings in a whole new power dimension to research. And I sometimes ask myself questions about the ethics of doing that. So that's the second. I think the other one has been, I've always grappled with and had difficulty with this idea of causing no harm in research. Again, I don't think I intentionally went out to harm anyone, but I've seen many interventions, whether they be research ones or whether they be interventions of NGOs or government interventions around welfare that target the poor. And what does targeting basically do? Well, it extracts them from their communities or their own networks and or things like that, because in inverted commas, they're privileged. And I often look at that and think, actually, that causes harm, longer term harm. And it makes me think about my research, because although I might go through ethical procedures and I'm careful in the way that I deal with my research at the moment, if I'm really honest, I don't know, when I did my PhD, I don't know how those communities are now faring, or the people who were involved in my research are now faring or doing. And therefore, I've got no idea, for example, if I know that I didn't cause harm at the immediate moment, but harm is something that can fester and might reappear in 5 years, 10 years after either research or an intervention. And of course, I've got no way of, maybe I should, but I've never gone back to check as that commitment to not harming participants, is it still intact 10 years when I'm no longer there? So I've always been a bit unsure about the fact that harm is something which can be produced over extended periods of time, and over times when I might not be present either. So again, we do what we can to make sure that we don't cause harm through our research at that moment. I'm not sure we do enough to think about what potential harms might come about 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. And of course, underneath harms, I mean risk. So again, I know of other people, and I know a case, a very good case, where someone took part in someone else's research, and I actually befriended their son about 5 or 10 years later. And the gentleman who had taken part in the research, so this is after a lag of 10 years, once the research had been completed, he came under a bit of scrutiny from the local community and was effectively ostracized for having got benefits because he was paid, but also then seen as someone who had given information about the community and all of that. So there's, you know, by taking part in some research, some of our participants expose themselves to elements of risk, and we're not always there to monitor that risk. And that does raise some questions about time and harm and ethics, I think.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I mean, I guess it's all about not only non-maleficence or not doing harm, but also justice. You know, who is the research for ultimately? Is it for ourselves in terms of our own careers, or is it actually ultimately for those participants? And I guess we have to be upfront about that in our applications, and, you know, what potential, not necessarily always what potential harms this research might be at risk of causing, but also the benefits and who actually does it benefit. And I guess what you're also saying there, Joe, is that there may well be an argument for more longitudinal studies, where, you know, you do actually go back at, you know, 6 months later or some years later. That's not always possible with funding streams, and it won't necessarily be possible with this necessarily this call, but it is something to bear in mind and think about. You touched on something really quite key in relation to your own research of poor in Bangladesh, Joe, because increasingly now research participants are seen as, almost for want of a better word, consultants, because we are taking their time, and it's now very common for researchers to actually put into their application some funding to pay participants for their time. So what do you see as the ethical issue there about perhaps paying somebody for their time, or even giving a gift in terms of inducing somebody to participate, because they may, especially if they're in a resource poor context or a resource poor setting, and how do you kind of marry that up with the fact that on the one hand you'll go in for a period of time, pay them, and then you withdraw and they don't get that payment after you leave?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point I was alluding to a bit earlier. So my initial reaction is that payment and voluntary participation in research aren't necessarily contradictory. I've never been in a situation myself where I've had to pay, but I've been working, you know, more frequently with research teams, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were small elements of payment going on. And again, I'm not against that at all. On the one hand, I think that especially people who are resource poor, you know, we take up their time. And when people take up my time professionally, I expect them to pay for it. So I've got no, you know, there's no reason why that shouldn't be applied elsewhere. But it goes beyond just paying of time. I think there's, at least in the world where I carry out research or what I want to do with my research, I want a lot of my participants to be much more closer to being co-producers of research and analysis. And that isn't just about time, of course, that's effort. So again, if I was working with someone else as a co-producer of research, if I was working with colleagues in my department, you know, we would expect some sort of compensation for that. But there is a risk, especially where you've got situations where it is resource poor, and the risk is, again, that certain people are favoured over others, certain people get paid and others don't. And I know of cases, I've seen it physically in front of me as well, where, you know, you have you have two brothers almost. In fact, I've written about this in an article, two brothers, one is shouting at the other not to get involved with the research because he will lose his reputation, his social connections in the community. And so you have two brothers fighting because one had decided to take part in a piece of research and was getting paid for it. So there is a real risk that by paying people, we, in inverted commas, privilege them, and that might expose them at times to elements of risk that we might not be aware of. It doesn't always happen, of course, but it could happen. And therefore, I think the only way around that is to be really clear to as many people as possible about the aims of the research and what you're trying to do with it. In other words, transparency. So that it's very clear, and that whoever's taking part in the research, that there's some sort of equity. You know, you're not paying someone something and then not paying someone else the same amount or less or more or whatever. I would add to further quick points about that. When we think about payment, we think of gifts and money. But again, in the line of research that I do, I've been very happy in the past to spend idle time, to take part in the lives of participants in ways that are outside of the questionnaire or the research moment. I've been quite happy sipping at tea and even paying for tea and things like that. In other words, you're trying to build up and break down some of those barriers that might exist between research or researched, and building up an element of trust. But again, there's a risk. You could easily get dragged into factions or particular groups. So it's about transparency and being aware that it's important to build up trust, and spending time with people outside of the research actually, you know, it's a form of payment in the sense that you're trying to be with them in a slightly different way. The second thing, again, very briefly, is the question itself raises an important question about the nature of research. So I talked earlier about bias in research. One of the big changes that's happened in research is that many of us are involved now in research where just producing knowledge for the sake of producing knowledge, it doesn't fly anymore. We've been asked serious questions, and I think for social scientists, these questions are even deeper, which is what's the benefit of the research, and who's benefiting from that research? And I think that then has a lot to say about voluntary participation of respondents and co-producers in our research, because we need to have a sense that we are carrying out research, rigorous, transparent, but with a view to hopefully identifying benefits for particular parts of the population or individuals. And I think that's an important question we need to ask ourselves in any research agenda, especially as social scientists again. Besides the creation of knowledge in itself, what other benefits are we going to be pushing at? And how will the beneficiaries know about this and benefit from it, as it were? So,
yes, you've hit on very important, the applied nature of the research. And I think that's, as the commissioning group will be looking to see what people put in the applications in relation to, you know, the outputs that not only are, you know, papers and published papers, but what are the possible outputs and the legacy of the research that we do. So I think you're right, that's really important. And of course, it also links to dignity for the participant, that they are not just people to be doing research on, but research with. And like you say, Joe, there are ethical issues. There's always going to be ethical issues around any project that we do, but it's about trying to minimize those risks. And as you say, one of them is about being very clear from the start, building up trust and rapport so that there's no power imbalance between the research, but obviously just being very upfront about people so that they know what they're getting themselves into, and that they know that the possible risks. I think that anybody viewing this conversation, Joe, would really like to read your paper about the two brothers. That sounds really fascinating. So we'll put that in the resources if that's okay with you. So I think you've really gone through some really, you've pulled out some really key ethical issues there, particularly when working with the poor. Is there any other just final advice that you'd give to people when they're contemplating and thinking about their project, being mindful of the ethical issues that might arise?
I think the biggest lesson I've taken away through thinking about ethics generally is to think about, in other words, have a greater degree of reflexivity in our research. There are things that we need to do, there are standards, there are procedures, there are guidelines, and they're all good and they're helpful. But if we're serious about ethics, then it's basically asking us to be much more reflexive in our research, which is an ongoing thing. It starts the moment we put pen to paper writing a proposal, and it might go on well after the research itself. And particularly in this particular call, in the work that I do and the work that many social scientists I think are involved in, we need to be much more aware of the power dynamics that's inherent in our research. And the only way to be really aware of that is to be constantly reflexive. And in other words, that we don't become lazy in research. We see it as something which will improve, is a positive thing to our research, but that we're constantly allowing ourselves to be asked questions about not only the quality of our research, but our position as researchers, which is a privileged position in that relationship of research. And I think if we can be reflexive, then I think that the ethics will be much healthier. And I also think what we're trying to do through our research will be more democratic, in the sense that either participants will be able to fully participate in our research, or the benefits of our research might actually go to those that we think might be advantaged, or those questions of injustice might be reversed or addressed, etc. So my final piece, I think, would be that yes, by all means, we need to try and foresee the major ethical challenges in any research, but the biggest ethical challenge is always going to be our own reflexivity. Can we be constantly reflecting on the nature of our research, not just in terms of its own rigor, but the impacts of it, and those impacts happen all the time. And of course, many of us will be working in research groups, so my own reflexivity also entails looking out for my colleagues, caring for them, and making sure not only that they don't do anything wrong, but that they do things which are right, and that they do things which benefit them. And therefore looking out for each other is also part of that reflexivity. Okay, well, thank you so much, Joe Devine, for having a really good delving into some of those research issues, specifically in Bangladesh, but other countries. Thank you so much for having an in conversation with me about that. Nice to talk to you too.